Alright guys, so I'm finally ready to do my review of Barbarians of Lemuria by Simon Washbourne. I've been talking a lot about doing this review, so let's get to it. So the game is based off of a lot of the older Sword and Sorcery genre stuff from the pulp era to, I'd say, around the 80s. And as the name suggests, it's heavily based around Lynn Carter's Lemuria, which it uses as the standard setting for the game, but it also fits nicely with other works of the genre like Robert E. Howard's or Clark Ashton Smith, or even a setting that you or your game master would create. The genre and the rule system blend very well together. I'd say a lot more than other games, and like Crypts and Things, which I talked about longer, didn't do as well of a job. But onto the rules themselves. First off, it's a very rules-light system. The system is very simple and very intuitive. Just to show how easy it is, it took about 10 minutes to make myself a character. As you can see, it takes up a lot less space than, say, Dungeons & Dragons character sheet, which can take pages with, really small print. Whereas you could probably use just an index card to house your character sheet with Barbarians of Lemuria. The game does use its own system. It doesn't use like a D20 or the D100 systems that are popular. So and it almost entirely uses just your simple D6s, your standard cube dice. There are a few others like D4 and D8 are for a few weapons. And a few magic stuff too, but that's kind of weird, so I'm going to get into that later. And taking actions is very easy. You said you have your 2d6 to take your action roll, and you roll, and if you get a 9 or higher, once you add in all the modifiers, then you succeed. So instead of difficulty being, this is, a hard one, you have to roll, an 11 instead of just a 9, like in D20, where you have a higher target goal. This just modifies it, so players always know what they're trying to hit, and you can always calculate it really easily. Combat uses the same system, so for combat you need to roll a 9 to hit once you add in your skill and attack and your enemy's dodge skills, and then once you roll damage, the armor of whoever's being hit takes away damage. So if you have, a chainmail shirt, which I think was 3 armor, and someone hits you with a longsword or something and you take 5 damage, then because you have that 3 armor, you only take 2 hit points out. And there isn't a leveling system or a class system. So when you make your character, which, hold on, let me pull this out. Instead you have, your 4 attributes, or your 4 base attributes and 4 skills, and you have 4 points for each of those, which you can do as you want. So if you want just a really strong character, you can have 4 in strength and 0 for everything else, or you can balance it evenly or mix it up as you want, and same thing for all your other skills. So it's really easy. And you also have careers which you can put points in, which I like because it got rid of that sort of simplified archetypal stuff that was used with a lot of class systems. But instead you could put careers in like soldier or hunter or magician or alchemist or whatever you want. And then when you go to take to do a skill check or something, if it's something that would help, like an attack roll, if you have ranks in soldier, that'll give you a bonus. Or archery, you might have your hunter ranks could come in, and stuff like that. So I think it resembles real life more since it doesn't have those archetypal stuff I was talking about. And the combination of the simple gameplay and the lack of classes does a good job of preventing like metagaming and power gaming, and just having like really OP characters, which I found was a big problem with 4th edition D&D. And yeah, so the magic, like I mentioned, is pretty weird. Rather than having like a list of spells all magic, or all arcane magic, I should say, wizards and sorcerers, for those who aren't as familiar with gaming, is generally called arcane magic. And they all fall into 4 simple categories. You have your cantrips, which are easy and small spells, like if I wanted to, make a small item like a coin appear in my hand or disappear, or, light a candle, that would be a cantrip. And those are the easiest and smallest spells. Then all other spells count as spells of the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd magnitude, which are all, more powerful. So 3rd magnitude is the biggest, and that's like causing an earthquake, or, something, that's really big, and then everything else falls in between. And the lack of spell list actually helps a lot, because rather than having to dig through your spell list, you would just tell the game master what you want to do. So, I want to climb a mountain. Well, the game master, okay, well, reasonably, someone who's not a wizard could use a rope and climb the mountain in a couple hours. So it's not, something earth-shattering. So he'll say, it's a 1st magnitude spell. So, you just describe what you want to do, and then, he tells you what type of spell it is, and you go. So it's a lot easier, a lot more streamlined. And going with the Sword and Sorcery motif, rather than just being able to cast a spell instantaneously, like in the D20 system where, your wizard just goes, oh, there's an enemy, pew, and, shoots lightning at him or something. You have to, it's like a lot more complicated, so any spells, like any of the magnitude spells, not anything other than cantrips, have long rituals you need to perform, and they might only work at certain times of the day, or for, your 3rd magnitude spell, certain times of the year, or need to be performed with a ritual sacrifice, or, stuff like that, that really sort of liven up and make it seem, a lot more like it's really powerful, and not just, something that anyone with a musty tome and some hours could learn how to just go pew and cast a spell. I mean, it really adds a lot more depth to the world. It makes magic seem, magical. Then there are, like, priestly magics as well, which, someone would get from the gods, rather than, like, the sword and sorcery wizard who forces nature with his whims and stuff. And priests don't have the same difficulty of performing spells. So, to simplify it, all priest spells would be cast the same way the wizard's cantrip is. But they can cast only a few amount of spells, much less than the wizard, and whereas the wizard can rest and regain spells, the priest has to perform, like, rituals at, the temple to their deity to regain the abilities to do their spells. And also, they can only cast spells that pertain to their deity. So, if your character is a priest of the storm god, then you might be able to cause rain or strike down your opponents with lightning, but you wouldn't be able to, do a fireball or healing spells, because your deity doesn't have anything to do with fire or healing or health. Another alternative to magic in general would be alchemy. And it acts how alchemists worked, or in some cases, how they claim to work in history. They can make potions or manipulate metals, but rather than a magic spell, they need, scientific instruments, and it's going to take a lot of time, and they can only do like real things. It's closer to the bounds of how we would view a scientist. So I thought the magic system was great. It's simpler and a lot more intuitive than in other games. And for instance, what I like to compare it to, or in this case distance itself from, was magic from 3.5 edition of Dungeons and Dragons, where the magic and spells chapters of the player's handbook took up 135 out of the 303 pages of the player's handbook. Over 40% of the player's handbook in 3.5 was just magic. Whereas in Barbarians of Lemuria, it's, I think it was maybe a few pages. I mean, it was just so, it's just boiled down to be a lot easier. And then last thing I'm going to say. Something I found rather odd was it contained no monster statistics at all. Although it does give a brief description of creatures that from Lynn Carter's Lemuria that it thought would work really well. It did throw me off initially, and I thought I'd have to say it was my only complaint about the game. But after thinking about it more, I actually really liked it. One reason is it prevents the players from knowing too much about monsters in-game. So, for instance, going back to D&D, since I DM a lot, I'm familiar with most of the monsters, or at least most of the ones from the first monster manual. So when I am player side in a game, I know all the monsters, maybe not front to back, but I know enough. Okay, this monster needs magic to do damage. This monster is susceptible to fire. So anytime a DM has some monster that he thinks is going to be like a big challenging boss fight, because I know so much about the monsters from DMing, I can just say, oh, okay, hey, party members, don't use your ice spells. It's going to make it stronger or something. So it ends up, sort of ruining the game just since I have that knowledge. So whereas with Barbarians of Lemuria, since there are no monster statistics, that's not a problem. Because, when I'm being the game master, I might have, and I put snow apes in my campaign. Their stats could be very different than, the snow apes in somebody else's campaign that I'm a player in. So even though I've GM'd and used the exact same monster, I don't actually know anything new or anything different than somebody who's playing for the first time will know about the monsters. So being a GM doesn't give a big advantage to over those players who haven't, and experienced players can be just as surprised by a creature coming up in a campaign, even if they've fought those same creatures a bunch of other times in other campaigns. It's going to be just as surprised, and they'll have to figure it out just as much as a player where it's their first gaming session ever. So it sort of evens out it evens out the playing field between the different experience levels of the players, and what sort of stuff they do and how they play the game. It makes it a nice even field. And it also does keep with that sword and sorcery genre, where bad guys are more often just, some bandits or some soldiers or maybe a wizard, but monsters are rare and frightening, whereas opposed to other games like D&D, where, running into a big band of orcs is no big deal. Running into 4 or 5 monsters in the same area is going to be really big in these low magic sword and sorcery games. And then with, as I mentioned, how simple the game system is, making up monsters would take a couple minutes of prep work, and as long as you have a rough idea of how the monster works, you could even just do some improv on the stats and make up the monster as the game's happening. Just overall, it is a great game. The rule system is very unique and I found very intuitive, and it does gaming in the sword and sorcery genre right. I can tell I'm going to use this system a lot, and there's a free version of it online. There is a deluxe edition that I didn't get, but again, with a free version, there's no reason why you shouldn't at least look into it. I cannot recommend this game enough.